This is Josh Mandel with the third in our series of brief introductions to new features in Smart v2. And in this video, we are going to review granular scopes. So as a quick reminder, scopes are a feature of the OAuth 2 authorization protocol that are used to negotiate exactly what permissions an app or a client is going to receive if it's approved to access data at all. And the idea with scopes is that a client can request a list of scopes that it wants access to that represent the specific permissions it's looking for. And then typically the user will have some influence on the outcome. The user might decide to reject the request altogether and just say no, or the user might approve all of the scopes that were requested, or the user might select a subset of scopes to approve. It's also possible for an app to receive more scopes or more permissions than it requests, but that's a pretty uncommon thing in the healthcare environment where we are very directly concerned with data minimization most of the time. So as a quick reminder from the Smart perspective, we define a set of scopes that are based on FHIR resource types and FHIR interactions. So we're going to look in the Smart App Launch specification, the current release, which is version 2. And then under the App Launch menu, we're looking at the Scopes and Launch Context page. And very briefly, we have a set of scopes that can be used to request clinical data that look something like the following example. So I might ask for a scope like patient/star.rs, and that means I want to be able to read all of the FHIR resources, read and search all of the FHIR resources associated with the patient record currently in context. And for this video, we're going to focus entirely on scopes that begin with patient/, which is to say there's some patient in context for this app's approval. And these are scopes that are going to grant access to different parts of that patient record. We've talked in other videos about where user-level scopes and system-level scopes fit in, and that story really hasn't changed between Smart v1 and Smart v2, so we'll just focus on patient-level scopes in this video. So in Smart v2, you can say scopes start with patient/, and then a specific FHIR resource type, or star, if you're looking for all FHIR resource types. And then we provide a list of FHIR interactions using this CRUDS syntax, CRUDS, for create, read, update, delete, and search. And then in addition to identifying those FHIR resources and the interactions that you want, you can optionally append a list of search parameters to limit access to only certain resources for which these search parameters match or apply. So let's look at a specific example here to make this concrete. Let's say I'm asking for a scope like patient/observation.rs. Well, that means if it's granted, a client would be able to access or query for all the observations, doing a read or a search associated with the patient in context. Now, observations in FHIR is a very broad set of resources. It can include vital signs, lab results, social history, physical exam findings, and so on. So maybe in some cases you don't want to grant access to all observations, but you're only interested in granting access to certain observations, like observations in the category of labs. And so as a quick reminder, in the FHIR spec, the observation resource defines a way to codify any kind of directly observable phenomenon, where anything you observe has a code saying, what did you observe? And a value saying, what was it? So the code might say cholesterol, and the value might say, this number of milligrams per deciliter. Or the code might say respiratory rate, and the value might say 12 per minute. Those would be examples of coded observations. And there's also what's called an observation category, which tells you what sort of observation was it. I mean, yes, it was cholesterol, but it's sometimes useful to know that cholesterol is a laboratory observation. Or yes, it was respiratory rate, but it's sometimes useful to know that respiratory rate is a vital sign kind of observation. So you can attach a list of categories or a set of categories to any specific FHIR observation to classify it in these various ways that apply. The core FHIR specification has a value set of different observation categories built in. So things like social history, vital signs, imaging, labs, exam findings, and so on. Those are all examples of categories that an observation can have. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom here, we can see there's a list of search parameters. And these search parameters are generally useful when you want to do a FHIR query or search. So you can narrow down your search based on category using this category search parameter. And just the same way you can do this in a search, well, with Smart v2, you can also use these search parameters to help refine your permissions or scopes. So instead of asking for a scope like patient/observation.rs, I might want to make that a finer grained scope and say, well, I'm not interested in all observations. I'm really only asking for permission to see observations with a certain category. And so in this case, just the same way you would use this category in a FHIR search, you can use this category to narrow down or further specify which observations you're requesting access to at the authorization layer. So that's the core of scopes in Smart v2. It's worth calling out that it's still pretty early days for Smart v2, and even servers that support things like specifying access to certain categories of observations might not yet do it using these Smart version 2 scopes. So one question you might have is, well, how can you tell if a particular server supports Smart v2 scopes? And the short answer is you tell that the same way you answer any question about what the server supports. You can go to the conformance section of the spec to see how this works. But we define a list of capabilities in this conformance section here. And so there's a set of capabilities that have to do with permissions. And so if a server says that it supports the permission-v2 capability, then you know you should use the Smart v2 scope syntax to talk to that server. And you should be asking for things like patient/observation.rs, maybe with some additional categories. If the server says it supports permissions v1, or if it doesn't say anything at all, well, you know you should probably be using Smart v1 style scopes to communicate. And as a quick reminder, those would be scopes like patient/observation.read. So we don't have those granular interactions here, and we don't have any search parameters allowed as suffixes here. So that's how you can tell if a server is going to support Smart v1 or Smart v2 or both. And it's perfectly fine for a server to support both of those scope syntaxes just by advertising support for both of those capabilities in the metadata statement. Last thing I want to note is this syntax for Smart v2 scopes is quite rich and powerful. And it's interesting to see servers begin to experiment with these capabilities. But many servers in the real world are not going to support these scopes in a dynamic way. They might just have a short list of hard-coded scopes and say, well, here's 20 pre-specified expressions that you can ask for. They will use this syntax, so we have a standard way to interpret them. But servers might not be parsing these kinds of statements on the fly and might not be able to provide access to arbitrary subsets of resources. And that's perfectly fine. That said, some of the cloud-native FHIR servers that are being built from the ground up to deal with things like FHIR search parameters on every resource, those servers might be in a better position to be able to support these kinds of granular scopes right off the bat. And I think the Vonk FHIR server from Firely is an example of one in that category today. We do also highlight a couple of features specifically as experimental. And these would be sort of interesting capabilities that the scope syntax allows, but we don't necessarily expect that real-world servers are going to support on the fly. So one of these would be search modifiers, something like saying, instead of all observations that have this specific link code, I might try to create a query for observations that have a link code in a specific value set. It's a very powerful way to write queries or potentially grant permissions based on sets of codes. But we explicitly mark this as experimental because in order for this to work, a server really has to have a fair amount of terminology, machinery available at the authorization layer. So we highlight that one as experimental. And then the other one that we highlight, it's worth mentioning here, is anything involving chaining. So anytime you see a dot here as part of a search parameter, you know we're going from the observation into the patient resource and then using the birth date of the patient to further specify. So this search parameter would mean find me all observations where the subject of the observation, the patient that we've observed something about, was born in 1990. And again, you can imagine this would be a very powerful and rich capability, but we call this one out as experimental because servers really need to have some very particular indexes in place to be able to support this kind of joining across tables or data structures at runtime within their authorization layer. So those are a couple of experimental features, but overall we're looking to this Smart v2 syntax as a way to help applications get access to just the data that they need. So that's been a quick overview of granular scopes in Smart v2, and next time we will take on asymmetric authentication.